Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the European Research Workshop on International Trade. This is part of a week-long event sponsored by the Center for Economic Performance at the LSE, much better, and CEPR to foster debate and evidence-based policymaking in an era in which that is a rare commodity. You can see here that there are several events going on over the course of the week, and there are even more going on at the LSE, and I encourage you to participate in them. My name is Minouche Shafiq. I'm the director of the London School of Economics and Political Science. And I'm going to just say a few words to kind of frame this discussion and then turn to the very distinguished panel we have to say their remarks. I think it's fair to say that over the last couple of years, there has been a huge amount of soul-searching around the rise of populism, the rejection of the holy trinity of economics, of the combination of liberal democracies, liberal economies, and a rules-based international system is the best of all possible worlds. And the diagnosis of that soul-searching has converged around the role of technology that favors highly skilled workers and urban areas, that globalization is driving that technological transformation even harder, and the consequences we've now seen in numerous pieces of research are now becoming very familiar. The hollowing out of the middle class, the rise of inequality, the decline of social mobility, regional disparities, and increased support of populist leaders, and in extremis, the sort of deaths of despair that people like Angus Deaton have written widely about. And so it's clear that the traditional economic response to these challenges has not worked. The traditional view, gains from trade, efficiency, expand the pie, compensate the losers, hasn't worked very well. And the reality is that the losers don't usually get compensated, and the attempts at regional rebalancing and reskilling of workers have been patchy at best. And the social dimensions have been huge. If I remember one trade union leader in the UK saying to me, "We must stop calling them those who got left behind. Perhaps we should call them those who've never been given a chance." And I think that our use of the term compensating the losers is dreadful. Who wants to be considered a loser? And perhaps we have worshipped a little too much at the altar of efficiency and not thought enough about the importance of social capital and social cohesion. And as a consequence of that, have paid a very high price in political support for the economic system that we think is best. So, the purpose of this session is to explore the policy solutions that might address our current conundrum, and focused around two questions. How can we ensure the gains from economic changes are shared more equitably? And two, what can be done to overcome economic and political polarization? And do economists have any new ideas to address these challenges? Now, we have four excellent panelists. I will not dwell on their CVs because they're well known enough to not need that, but I'll just introduce them briefly. We have Professor Elhanan Helpman, who is Professor of International Trade at Harvard and a Fellow of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. He is the father of the New Trade Theory and the New Growth Theory, which emphasized, of course, the role of economies of scale and imperfect competition. Next to him, we have Steve Machin, who is Professor of Economics at the LSE and Director of the Center for Economic Performance, also a Fellow of the British Academy. And Stephen's work is very much on labor market inequality, social mobility, crime, and the interactions between them. After him, we'll hear from Marian Jansen, who's the Chief Economist at the International Trade Center. She's previously been at the World Trade Organization and the ILO. And her work is very focused on standards and regulations in international trade, services trade, migration, and the economics of international economic law. And then finally, we'll hear from Beata Javorcic, who is the Professor of Economics at the University of Oxford and a Fellow at All Souls. And she's the Program Director for International Trade and Regional Economics at CEPR in London. and prior to that was at the World Bank. And she will focus particularly on how globalization has exacerbated the gender wage gap and how FDI flows may affect men and women differently. So, with that, let me turn to Professor Heltman to start us off.
Thank you.
I think if you start, if not, I'll give you mine.
Okay, thanks very much. I want to bring to this discussion some new perspectives that are relevant for the effects of globalization and how to handle them. And I will focus on a US perspective, which I think is actually quite important for Europe as well. So let me start with some observations. The political economy has been used to analyze the formation of trade policies, and this has been very helpful in understanding the variation in rates of protection across sectors within countries, as well as the variation in levels of protection across countries. Now, in this approach, the main emphasis has been on the role of special interest groups on the one hand and voters on the other. So by contributing to political campaigns, special interest groups provide politicians with resources that they can use during the elections in order to attract voters. And what's important here is that they attract, especially with these resources, voters who are ill-informed, and especially about the effects of the policies that the special interest groups promote. On the other hand, by caving in to special interests, politicians lose some votes, and the votes that they lose are especially among well-informed voters who are sort of understand the economic outcomes. Now, this tension produces a trade-off that political actors have to balance in order to, when they form their economic policies. So this is a well-known framework that has been used in economics to analyze the formation of trade policies. And in this framework, voters' preferences over policies are viewed through a particular prism, which is a narrow economic interest prism. And this approach colors the response that one can derive to expanding globalization. Now, recent evidence suggests, however, that voters' policy evaluations are not driven by narrow economic interests. So to understand the future of globalization requires actually a better understanding of the prisms through which voters actually view economic integration. Well, there is an emerging view in political science that places identity politics before or along economic self-interest as a force that shapes voters' preferences for political parties and for economic policies. And there's ample support for this observation recently in both the US and Europe. So populism, for example, is just a form of identity politics in which a country's voters narrow down the social groups with which they identify. And part of this consists of redefining what the nation is by essentially excluding elites and also minorities or immigrants, and sort of redefining the relative group which has to be taken into account in forming the policy. In the US, something very interesting has happened. There is a white identity group that has emerged, and this group played a key role in the 2016 election. And it plays a central role, essentially, among the core supporters of President Trump to these days. So while the white identity group has evolved over a long period of time, it was not politicized until the 2016 elections, and this is where it became very powerful. There are two excellent books on the subject, one entitled White Identity Politics, and the other Identity Crisis, that use a lot of data to analyze the evolution of the group, of this group and its patterns of behavior. Among their findings is that social identification with the white identity group is negatively correlated, for example, with education and income, and positively correlated with blue-collar jobs. And it is also positively correlated with residency in rural America or in the south part of America. Now, importantly, for the issues that are on the table today, members of this group believe in zero-sum competition. So in particularly, they believe that if immigrants obtain jobs, then there are fewer jobs for what they called true Americans. Or alternatively, if foreign countries succeed, this is bad for the US. The US somehow loses as a result, and their white identity group loses as well. So, importantly, whites with high racial solidarity in this group are more inclined to believe that whites are discriminated against actually in the US. So they believe in a sort of reverse racism in the United States, and this has evolved particularly during the Obama administration. And many of these individuals support the restrictions on immigration, and their attitudes are less shaped by economic reasoning and more by hostile attitudes toward what in sociology or social psychology is called outgroups. Now, this white group has been galvanized during the 2016 elections, as I mentioned before, and it was induced to engage in political activity by essentially animosity toward these various outgroups, including foreign countries, and by a very strong sense that their group status was endangered both domestically and internationally. Voters who view white Americans as prototypical of the country also see threats to the standings of the US in the world as a threat to their standing, not only in the world, but also within the United States. As a result, higher white racial solidarity is positively correlated with support for trade restrictions and restrictions on offshoring, or more generally, just interactions with foreign countries. Now, this may partly explain, for example, why these people think that international trade is responsible for rising inequality, while the evidence actually shows that international trade and offshoring had only a modest impact on inequality. And I gave a lecture here in the British Academy 2 years ago on the topic. So to illustrate one particular question that has been asked, think about this following. Respondents to a 2016 survey were asked whether they agree or disagree with the following statement, and I read: "This country would be better off if we just stayed home and did not concern ourselves with problems in other parts of the world." And you have to answer yes or not. Do you agree with this statement or not? So only 20% of the respondents agreed with the statement among those at the lowest level of white racial identity. But those at the high level of white racial identity responded twice as many, essentially 40%. And there is this type of correlation along this scale. So this sort of illustrates that white identity breeds negative attitudes toward globalization. Now, the attitudes that I have just described are well documented in the US, and these two books cover a lot of data analysis in order to show it. And while European attitudes are not identical to US attitudes, they appear to be similar in many respects. Unfortunately, these attitudes lead to economic and political polarization that has been exploited so far by some extreme political parties. In the past, economic research did not pay much attention to the role of identity politics in shaping electoral outcomes and policy formation of the type that I mentioned before. But this has changed recently, and there is an emerging literature that addresses these issues. Now, while globalization has not benefited every individual on the planet, it helped, for example, to alleviate hundreds of millions of people from extreme poverty, or what the World Bank defines as extreme poverty. As expected, it also has changed the relative economic position of countries in the globe. And this has led, in turn, to tensions in the international arena, and we read about these tensions every day in the newspapers. In order to keep benefiting from an integrated world economy, countries need, therefore, to pursue domestic policies that shield those who are hurt by globalization by providing better safety nets than those available today. I think many economists agree with this recommendation. But if you take the view that I've just explained, then in addition to this sort of obvious policy that has to be pursued, they have to find ways to reduce alienation among ethnic and socioeconomic groups. And importantly, I think we have to convince the voters that economic transactions are not a zero-sum game. This is very important. As of now, the prevailing political atmosphere is ill-suited for achieving this aim, and it is really necessary to find ways to make these points salient, both in the public debate and in policy formation. So let me stop here.
Okay, thank you very much, Alain. Steve.
Okay, thanks. So I'd like to organise my discussion around two kind of broad areas. First, to talk about trends that have been going on in international markets, and second, talking about that in the context of the kind of economic and social consequences of globalisation. Then I'd like to just kind of try and pull them together a little bit, hopefully in terms of the round of questions that we were given in advance as a panel. Okay, so let me begin on the economic trends that have been going on in international markets. So first kind of observation, I have four observations here actually. The first observation is that concerns the very weak performance of labour markets and the poor economic performance of many nations that have occurred in the last 10 to 15 years. I think there's been two key features in that have hit most developed nations, the one being real wage stagnation, the other one being sluggish productivity growth. Both of these, interestingly, probably predate the onset of a financial crisis, although they've been much more severe since the financial crisis started in 2007, 2008. Of course, productivity in many countries, especially in the US and Europe, experienced a short burst and a following bubble from the internet boom that occurred in the early 2000s. And that's not been seen since anywhere. And those kind of productivity levels have not been returned to. Real wage growth has been really weak, very weak, almost everywhere. This dates back to different starting points in different countries. It actually dates back a long way in the United States, back to 1979. There hasn't been any growth at the median in real wages since 1979 in the US. Very marked for men. In the UK, there's been very sharp actual real wage falls that have occurred in the last 10 to 15 years. Median real wages are still not back at their pre-financial crisis levels. Less well known, I think, is Germany, as another example. Germany's actually had no real wage growth at the median since the mid-1990s as well. This kind of very poor real wage performance has characterized lots of countries, apart from a few that have very special circumstances, and there's hardly any of them in the OECD. So that's my first observation. A second follows on very conveniently from what Elhan has spoken about, which is the rise of populism and identity politics, and the slowdown, and in some places reversal of trade openness that has gone hand in hand with more recent patterns of change there. Nowhere more marked really than what's going on in the UK and the US. And I'll return to that soon. The third observation I wanted to make is that over the last few decades, social mobility has stalled in many countries. Two dimensions of social mobility. Relative mobility, just where you are, whether you go up in the distribution or go down in the distribution relative to other people. That's actually not improved anywhere. In some countries it's worsened. And actually one feature of very innovative big data research in economics, some stuff that Raj Chetty did in the US, some stuff we've been doing here, has actually uncovered very important spatial differences in this persistence of poor social mobility that's been uncovered. Moreover, more recently, absolute intergenerational mobility, that's whether you do whether you in your generation are doing better than your parents in absolute terms, not just in relative terms, in absolute terms, has actually been falling in various places. And of course, this is a direct consequence of the weak real wage growth that I'm talking about. So a greater percentage of individuals now have worse living standards than their parents did at the same age when they were, I don't know, 30 years before or so. There's been a big drop in the US in absolute intergenerational mobility because of a longer period of lack of real wage growth that's occurred there. It's been a feature of the UK over the last 10 or 15 years, so now you've got the kind of double whammy of falling absolute intergenerational mobility and either stagnant or falling relative social mobility as well. So if you also return to the spatial dimension I mentioned a moment ago, if you actually correlate these changes in either real wage growth or in social mobility across spatial areas, of course you see the rise of populist politics being much more concentrated in the places that have worse or deteriorating social mobility. Those are also the places, of course, that have manufacturing decline, lots of social dysfunction, the kind of prescription opioid epidemic going on in some certain places in the US. My fourth observation, my last one, is on the changing nature of work. There's been very big changes in the way that work is organised and defined, especially with some of the new technologies that have been permeating into workplaces, and especially to do with the use of advanced digital technologies in work. And so the kind of work landscape has changed quite a lot. In many countries, there's been a big rise in solo self-employment. What I mean by solo self-employment is self-employment without any employees, not the kind of entrepreneur kind of model we normally think about self-employment. It's actually true, if you look in most OECD countries, the share of solo self-employment in total self-employment is rising almost everywhere. There's been an increase in the kind of gig economy jobs, agency work, multiple job holding, and so on. So the nature of the labour market is rather different now, a lot different now compared to what it was some 15 or 20 years ago. Now, a lot of this has been very hard to quantify in orthodox data sources. And so, of course, then we don't quite know as much about how this is, what the full implications of this really are. What is definitely true is there's become this very much hazier definitional line between what's somebody who's in employment or who's in self-employment. There's a kind of hinterland. Uber drivers, I guess, being a classic, classified as self-employed, but they are obviously working in some way for a company. Hence, many of the legal cases have occurred. I guess the key issue associated with these jobs, and in terms of what we're talking about here, is whether they do offer more flexibility for people, as their advocates would promote, or whether they're actually dead-end jobs which have very little career advancement prospects. On balance, it looks more like the latter, because there's a lot of people who actually want more work, who are actually associated with these kinds of jobs. So these 4 points, I think, are all important big shifts, but do not seem to be transitory. They seem to be relatively permanent shifts that have gone on over the last few decades. They've already had important economic consequences, some of which are linked to rising globalisation and indeed the pullback from globalisation that's been experienced in the last couple of years. So let's begin with that. I want to now consider the economic consequences. So let's begin with a trade pullback or cutback or backlash against trade that's been a key feature of the rise of populist and identity politics. So of course, the two big examples so far studied in the research are what's happened to in the UK since the EU referendum of June 2016, and what's been happening in response to the tariffs that President Trump has introduced in lots of sectors now. It seems that both are exerting important economic effects. So it seems like even though the whole Brexit issue is obviously not resolved yet, but it seems like there's already been important economic effects that have occurred in the wake of the referendum. So one feature is, and some various of my colleagues, some of whom are here at CEP, have worked on showing that price inflation went straight up after that, and particularly on goods that are imported. And so price inflation rose. Perhaps more important, I think, is that there seems to be a permanent depreciation of the exchange rate. We know it depreciated. It was the biggest fall. The 24-hour change that occurred on the night of the referendum was the biggest fall since Bretton Woods, any of the four major world currencies. So that exchange rate depreciation seems to have hit workers pretty hard. Their real wages have fallen. We have a paper showing that training has been cut back on by employers. And the way this seems to have worked is that actually the exchange rate depreciation made imports, particularly intermediate imports, more costly. So there's been a cost shock that hit certain sectors more than others. And that has lowered relative wages in most sectors. It's also caused training cutbacks in most sectors. And on the other side of the coin, there does not appear to be any beneficial revenue gains from exports, which seems to be a striking feature of what's been going on. So, of course, these patterns of change do not augur very well for future productivity. There seems to be a de-skilling of the workforce that's already happened in the 2 years data that we look at after the referendum, as real wages have fallen, and future earnings potential has also fallen because training has been cut back on. Okay. Secondly, how about the alternative work arrangements? Well, the alternative work arrangements also seem to have been a factor in dampening down wage growth that's occurred because they seem to put downward pressure on wages. Part of this is because more so than regular employees doing traditional jobs in particular sectors, it seems that gig workers and solo self-employed workers very much want more hours when they're asked questions in surveys, so they're pretty much underemployed. So if you kind of think, therefore, there's some kind of reserve army of these workers out there, they're not getting enough hours, they'd like to work more hours, but they can't get them. It seems like that's actually had downward pressure on wages as well. Many of their wage rates are very low. They're working on low wages without any form of social protection if they're classified as self-employed as well. Those solo self-employed are not covered by minimum wages. They don't have sick pay provision. They don't have holiday pay provision. They don't have pension arrangements as well. So we've carried out some surveys of gig workers and self-employed workers in the UK, the US and Italy. This is some work I've been doing with Tito Boeri, the late Alan Kruger and Giulia Gipponi at the LSE. And these kind of show these patterns. But actually, if you ask the solo self-employed workers which benefits they would like most, it's not surprising at all. In the UK and Italy, they would like pensions, and in the US, they would like healthcare coverage. Very much so. that they're not getting at the moment. This is more pronounced for gig workers than it is for self-employed workers as well. Regarding changes in technology and productivity, I'm going to conclude in a moment. These seem to be absolutely key to future developments. We need to think about how productivity can be boosted and growth, and find out sources where growth can come from. So we had a conference last week actually on industrial policy at the LSE, and Danny Roderick gave a keynote talk where he gave a great presentation about industrial policy and industrial strategy, and the new versions as compared to the old, rather bad reputation type versions of picking winners and so on. And he said, and I think this is an extremely good idea, that industrial policy aiming at generating good jobs is an extremely good aim to have, and good jobs where people have proper human capital provision, proper work arrangements, and so on. So it seems to me that actually building proper good jobs with good skills in decent jobs to complement the kind of new technologies and automation, and not low-wage jobs that have very little career progression, seems to be an important thing. I think it dovetails rather nicely with what Elhan said about the socially excluded groups, both from the labour market and perhaps from society more generally. And to try and ensure that the trends of higher inequality and low social mobility and falling social mobility can be potentially reversed. With inclusive growth, I know it's a cliched phrase, but inclusive growth is a real aim, not just a kind of talking point and token gesture. I think that is where the direction we need to be thinking about if we can offset some of these negative trends that have been occurring.
Marion.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to this panel. I will start my intervention with two anecdotes and move from the second anecdote to some policy discussion. First anecdote takes place 2006, 2007 in a distinguished room like this, bigger, at the WTO. Around 200-300 people are sitting in a room listening to Kenneth Rogoff. 200-300 WTO staff, maybe staff from other UN organizations, the kind of people who consider themselves rather privileged. And Kenneth Rogoff starts his intervention as follows. He says, growth in the past years has only benefited 1% or less of the population. And then he adds, and you are not among that 1%. That was the first time in my life I considered that I may be part of the losers you just mentioned, Minouche. When I took the cab this morning, I understood clearly from the cab driver that I'm also part of what is the hated elite. That's because of my education and my job. So now I'm a loser and a disliked elitist, not a nice position to be in. Maybe I deserve this because I'm sometimes wondering how successful I've been in my job. And that relates to my second anecdote. At the beginning of the financial crisis, 2009, the head of the research division of the International Chamber of Commerce came to see me. At that moment, I was working for the International Labour Office. And he said, I would like you to work with the WTO on a volume, on a book, with the title, Making Globalization Socially Sustainable. But that's already strange that somebody comes with a title before you know what the book is going to be about. But anyway, I asked him, why do you, International Chamber of Commerce, representative of big business, want us to work on a book with the title, Making Globalization Socially Sustainable? And his answer was the following. He said, my members, big business, have the impression that people, voters, don't like globalization. We have the impression that increasingly people think globalization is negative for them. And if this is the case, then they may start to vote against globalization. There may be a backlash against globalization. And the backlash against globalization is bad for business. Now, we received funding from them for the volume. We did a joint book with contributions from people like Danny Roderick, Nina Pavchnik, John Haltiwanger. The book was published 2011, was quite popular, was a lot discussed in the policy community. But the backlash against globalization nevertheless happened. And I'm aware of this every time I'm going, like this week, to G20 meetings, to trade and investment working group discussions, and where over the past 2 or 3 years, we have seen the tensions rising. We have seen the atmosphere becoming nasty. We have seen diplomacy becoming nasty. And from this meeting now in Japan, we are not expecting a very nice outcome either. So we are there, backlash against globalization happens. So what I would like to do now is to discuss what kind of policy solutions were we looking at in that book and how does that relate to what we currently see. What we did in the book is that we had a relatively standard discussion of what do we know about globalization and employment, globalization and inequality, and globalization and job security, standard based on the literature as it was at the time. But then we also asked a number of authors to look at policy solutions. And that was not so obvious because some of these policy solutions would lie in the labor market field. And trade economists and labor economists do not necessarily always meet each other and talk to each other. The policy solutions we discussed in the book were redistribution, because that inequality is an issue we already knew 10 years ago. Social protection, social safety nets, but importantly we discussed at the time already, how are you going to finance this? And it was a political scientist, Carl Boix, who pointed out something that we learn in the first year of economics, but we forget it when we do our PhD, that it's difficult to tax the more mobile production factor. So what Carl wrote is that if capital is the winner, capital is terribly mobile, labor is not, how are you going to redistribute if you cannot tax capital? The topic of taxation came at the time, started to become fashionable. Piketty's book was published a few years later. And I think that's a topic that has remained on the agenda. It's a topic where a lot has happened in the past years. We have seen taxation being discussed at the G20 level. We have seen international initiatives, for instance, on base erosion and profit shifting. We have seen a lot of activity in the European Commission on taxation of multinationals. So when people tell me nothing is happening at the international policy sphere or at the multilateral level, I'm saying, well, maybe not in the trade sphere, but on taxation, there has been action. Maybe not enough, and maybe it hasn't been communicated enough, because I do believe that many voters, including my taxi driver this morning, would be very happy to hear how much is being done to at least collect the taxes to be able to redistribute. 2 other policies were discussed in that report: education and infrastructure. Education was a topic that we found difficult to discuss. We can only discuss education as mainstream economists. We like to look at education figures, how many people have a university degree, how many people have a secondary degree, but we find it difficult to look at education in the context of, for instance, industrial policy, where you may think about, do I need to invest in coding? Do I have to invest in pharmaceuticals? Do I have to invest in certain types of agro-industry jobs, where you have to pick sectors? That's what you have to do in education. So 10 years ago we noticed, very important topic, but we don't really know how to tackle this. We are 10 years further, and I think on that theme, I have the impression we are at the same level. We know it's important, but we do not know exactly how to tackle it, in particular in the primary and secondary education, where I have the impression that the new generations are not at all ready for the digital shocks that are coming up. I'm also wondering whether one reason why we're not advancing on education is that it's politically not sexy. Everybody agrees that education is important. And if all the parties agree in a democracy, you can't win an election with that topic. So it's not the kind of thing you start to invest in. So yes, advancement on taxation, not maybe a lot on redistribution and social safety nets with those taxes. I think not a lot of advancement on education, and when it comes to infrastructure, I'm puzzled. So that's a topic that has always been very fashionable in the EU. A lot of funding has gone into infrastructure investments in the regions that were not in the less wealthy regions. Didn't really fit into our standard mainstream economic models, but what's happening, China is currently heavily investing in infrastructure in its country and in the surrounding countries, but it's getting a very bad press with this. I will leave it here. Not a lot of success, I think not a lot of progress, and that may explain why we are in this not so good situation with respect to people's attitude towards globalization.
Okay. I think we would call that British understatement. Peter, what about you?
So let me make 3 observations and then come back to the question of what can be done. But before I proceed, let me make a disclaimer. The EBRD affiliation listed on the slide is my future affiliation, so today I'm speaking in personal capacity. So observation number 1. Globalization has a multitude of distributional effects, some of which are quite nuanced. So we have been focusing very much on low-skilled males, mostly white males, competing with imports from China. But I would argue that college-educated women working in the export sector may also be affected by globalization. So think about a college-educated woman who is working on the sales side, on the logistics side, in accounting, in an exporting firm in Norway. If she needs to talk to her foreign customers who are in a different time zone, that means that she may have to take calls before the standard office hours, after she finishes work. That means that she may have to travel on a short notice. That all creates difficulties on the home front, which means that either she shies away from promotions, from putting more effort, or, even worse, she is perceived by her colleagues as not being able to put enough effort, and therefore as a less valuable employee. Is this a crazy idea? Well, actually not quite. You can see it in the data. So take worker-employer matched data from Norway, a beacon of gender equality, and estimate a wage equation. You can control for worker characteristics, you can control for worker-firm match, you can control for firm-year heterogeneity. What you will find is that exporting firms have a higher gender wage gap than non-exporters. Moreover, you will find that the gender wage gap is increasing in the share of exports in a given firm, and it's increasing with the time difference between Norway and the export markets. And this is true for college-educated women, and this effect is larger for if you look at workers under 45 years of age. Second observation. We tend to think of developing countries, emerging markets, as countries that gained from globalization, and that's absolutely true. But even emerging markets are not immune to the distributional effects that globalization and technological progress brings with them. In the 1990s, there was a literature documenting increasing skill premium in developing countries, and that was one reason why we sort of stopped investigating, the trade impacts on wage inequality, because that went against our sort of theoretical predictions. Also, we see that now emerging markets see disappearance of middle-skilled jobs. EBRD just did a nice report on how to avoid the middle-income trap, where they show that new EU member states, so the countries like Poland, Slovakia, Bulgaria, and so on, saw a 5 percentage point decline in the share of middle-skilled jobs. But interestingly, in those countries, you don't see much of a backlash against globalization, or at least not yet. Observation number 3. We used to believe that as long as growth is trickling down, distributional effects don't matter. But now it turns out that an increase in the living standards that benefits the whole population does not make a country immune to populism. So think about my own country, Poland, a poster child for a successful transition. Country that went from deep economic crisis, food shortages of basic goods in the 80s, to being a rich country by the World Bank definition. The only EU country that registered positive economic growth during the recent financial crisis. Moreover, if you split the population of Poland by income deciles, you will see that each decile saw an increase in living standards over the past 30 years, and that this increase in living standards was higher, the annual growth in income was higher than the average for G7 rich countries. These are figures that, that come actually also from the EBRD. So Poland saw a tide that lifted all boats, and yet it's a country where the ruling party came on the platform that it convinced people that the transition in Poland has been mishandled. Right? That things are terrible, that the past 30 years, when we saw this big increase in income in every decile of the population, that was a terrible period. Where does this come from? Well, it comes from the fact that people in the higher deciles of the income distribution saw faster growth in incomes than those in the lower deciles. So there is decompression of wages. That was a natural phenomenon after the artificial compression during communist times. And that happened, and that fueled a lot of discontent. Interestingly, at this point, support in Poland for the European Union is at all-time high. 91% of the population believes that the EU is a great thing. So, what can be done? What do these three observations tell us what we need to think about? One, I think protectionism is not the answer. And it's not the answer because reshoring is not going to bring jobs back. Even if multinationals bring the production back, they are going to automate. So that's not going to translate in lots of good jobs. It means that we should be protecting workers, not protecting jobs. Right? So the European system of flexible labor markets combined with insurance, unemployment insurance, so the flexi security system is probably the best we can do. Second, if it's inequality, and it is inequality that fuels populism, then we need to worry about it. We want to worry about inequality of opportunities. And this inequality of opportunities arises when, for instance, school districts are funded by local taxes, as happens in the US. So if a community gets hit by trade or technology or something else, automatically local taxes are lower, and automatically the schools in that area suffer, and that brings lower opportunities for children in the future. The final thing, what we need to do is talk to enlightened people, like those AmCham people who came to Marian and asked for a report, because it is important that key stakeholders take responsibility. And it's great that OECD is doing work on tax-based erosion and on profit shifting, but I think multinationals have to take greater responsibility, because at the moment they are perceived as tax evaders, as outsourcers, as firms that do not contribute much to local communities. And if they do not change that perception, there will be even a greater backlash.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me start just by drawing some common themes and asking a question to the panel. I think one of the themes that comes out very clearly is sometimes who benefits from an economic policy matters more than the size of the total benefit. It reminds me of a joke that I heard in Ukraine, where a worker was asked, you can wish for anything you want in the world, but I'll give your neighbor 2 times as much. And he thought really hard. And he said, take out an eye. There is a piece of human nature in which distribution matters more than anything else. And one of the puzzles of our current predicament is that most countries have been unable to address the distribution compensation question. And partly the anti-globalists would say, but you can't have decent social policies because capital is mobile. And so if we try and have decent social policies, the capital will all flee elsewhere. And so my question, I guess, to the panel is, how do you build the political consensus for the kinds of policies that would help people benefit from globalization? You know, if you look in the US, for example, there was quite a decent policy called the Trade Adjustment Program, which had everything in it that you would expect: worker retraining, relocation grants, focused on industries which were declining in the industrial heartland. All the ingredients were there, but Congress refused to allocate a serious budget to it. I think, as you said, Steve, every country in the world is cutting its worker training budgets. Both public sector financing of worker reskilling and firms are also cutting those budgets. We know that you could make flexible work socially sustainable by giving those workers benefits, pension rights, health benefits, and that could be legislated, and yet there's no political will to do that. And so in the absence of that, do we have to go back to, none of us want to go back to protectionism despite the Trump administration's attempts, and we know that will fail. Do you have to go back to some kind of industrial policy strategy, which is sort of what Danny's trying to argue? How do you manage the politics of a better place? Maybe I'll start with you.
I don't know. There is a view which I didn't discuss, and one of the authors of this view is a member of your faculty, David Soskis. So according to this view, which is a sort of optimistic view, he wrote together with one of my colleagues in the government department, Torben Iversen, a book called Democracy and Prosperity. And if I loosely sort of summarize their argument, so according to this view, there is a symbiotic relationship between advanced capitalism and democracy. And this may yield, if you want to take a step further, some complementarity between advanced capitalist democracies and globalization, which is sort of the entire argument that they pursue. Now, what is sort of important is that in their theory, the middle class voters are the decisive voters. And for this reason, you may conclude that populism, for example, is only a temporary phenomenon, and that the system will take care of itself and will move back to a positive equilibrium. And you may also conclude, perhaps, that the backlash of globalization is only temporary, if you take this view. Now, unfortunately, I think the number of advanced capitalist democracies is actually very small. And there are many other type of countries that operate in the international arena, and they play a very important role, and not only important role, but also a growing role in the global economy. So even if we sort of accept this optimistic view, the fact that there are these other countries make it, and a shrinking middle class, makes it very difficult. And as we know from labor economists like Steve, polarization of employment has reduced the role of the middle class as a stabilizing force, and also as a political force. And identity politics has increased in stature, and therefore it has polarized the political system. So we have economic polarization on one hand and political polarization on the other hand, for somewhat different reasons, although they are, I think, related to each other. And therefore, it's hard to predict whether the stabilizing or the destabilizing forces will have the upper hand. I don't think we can really predict the outcomes. But as I said, I think we have to focus on job security, security of employment, security of income. There's a whole range of issues that is important to take care of, especially when there are all these pressures that change work arrangements and they change employment opportunities. And there are the other things which I mentioned before. We have to find a way to reduce the tensions between the competing social groups. And finally, which is also important, I think, we have to convince people that economics is not a zero-sum game. This is really quite terrible that so many people take this view. As far as industrial policies is concerned, I leave it to Steve.
Steve.
Actually, it's interesting. So it's actually one of the institutions that Everson and Soskis actually pick on is retraining systems across countries, and they actually emphasise the importance of that. So I'd like to come back to skills and retraining, especially in the face of technical change. So I think people just have to put their hands up and realise that for over many decades, certainly in this country, probably since the golden age, the education system has been disequalising. And what it's done is it actually reinforces already existing inequalities. Okay. Now it doesn't mean it has to. Education, the idea of education being a great leveller has just not turned out to be true in practice. It's actually reinforced already existing inequalities and actually damaged social mobility in doing so. It doesn't have to be like that. And so I actually think serious thoughts about the education system are actually absolutely vital to this. I think there's several features of it. We could probably talk all night about it, but I'll just highlight a few. So one, of course, is the balance between higher education and vocational education, and how you get that right. We probably are churning out too many graduates and not having people coming through the vocational system who are competing with the lower end graduates to actually reduce skill premium between graduates and non-graduates. And the vocational education system is still very unsatisfactory. There have been various moves to try and improve it, but it's still very, very unsatisfactory. Whereas in other countries it operates rather well, and of course those are the countries that have much lower inequality, and where education is less disequalising than it is here and in the US, where inequality levels are higher. So Scandinavian countries, and to some extent Germany, Austria, Switzerland actually have education systems that do prepare everybody for the labour market better than just some people. So that's one thing. On the adult retraining side of things, it's the same point I would make. In various countries, quite a lot of money is spent on adult education, and particularly on retraining people when they lose their jobs, particularly when they're hollowed out from the middle part of the distribution. It seems we only have limited evidence on this, but this hollowing out of jobs in the middle, the routine jobs that have been substituted for by computer capital and other forms of automation, whilst lower skilled jobs that don't involve routine tasks and involve other non-routine tasks that can't be substituted for by computer capital and automation and AI and so on, have stayed up. One feature that seems to be true is that in Britain and America, if you get displaced from those jobs, you probably go down the skill distribution. So the classic idea about the car assembly worker going and working at McDonald's is much more likely than you moving up the distribution. But in some other countries, actually, people tend to move both ways. Some people drop down, some people move up. And of course, those are the places where the actual retraining systems by governments are there. So I'll say one last thing on policy. So in the LSE Growth Commission, we spoke about this on the issues to do with skills and infrastructure. But actually, the kind of tax credit system is very skewed towards giving tax credits for physical capital, particularly for R&D tax credits, which actually do work in some settings. Although many cases when they don't, companies just get completely bailed out when the R&D isn't successful, when the innovation activity is not successful because of the way the tax credits operate. If you think about human capital tax credits, we have hardly any of those, whereas some countries do. I mean, Austria, Germany, Switzerland again have serious human capital tax credits. Sometimes for people when they lose their jobs and they get retrained. Sometimes actually for continuing adult education and training in work. It seems to me there's a real imbalance in policy between tax credits about whether they should be targeted towards physical capital, R&D capital, or human capital. And actually that's something that could actually be really quite important for people who maybe have been let down by the education system. but then would want to engage in some kind of lifelong learning. And I think some serious academic research actually on human capitalist experts and what their likely implications would be is actually a really important thing that we could be working on as well.
Good, thank you, Steve.
You asked about how can we get the political consensus or politically move towards the kind of policies that can help us to make globalization socially sustainable. One thing I feel quite strongly about is that I think that voters would understand what can work. At least the median voter does. If you don't get the right policies right now, it's, in my view, not because the voters don't understand what they can do, but because they're not given the right options. And partly, to a large extent, my thinking about this is determined by my experience in Switzerland. You may know that in Switzerland, they have this very unique referendum system where every 3-4 weeks people are invited to vote about rather complex issues. And you have seen over the past years a number of votes going in surprising directions. There was a vote on getting shareholders, giving them a bigger say on manager pay, in order to lower the discrepancies in the wages within a single company. And a few months ago, there was a vote on taxation. Switzerland is currently under pressure to equalize taxes for foreign companies and local companies in order to be in line with the EU state aid laws, I think. And so the Swiss, what they did is that they said, oh no, we have to reduce all the taxes to the level of Ireland in order to survive. If not, all the multinationals are going to leave. The big parties were all supporting this. This tax deal has been proposed to the population. Low taxes, including important loopholes for R&D, for all kinds of issues that would allow companies not to pay any taxes at all. And people voted against it. They said no, they understood if we say yes, maybe the multinationals don't leave, but in a few years there will be no money left in order to pay for our schools, for our hospitals, for our roads. People understood these complicated texts. So, but the difference between Switzerland and other countries is that in Switzerland, voters can vote on these individual laws. In a country like Germany or the UK, every few years you have to decide for a party that offers you a mix of deals. And somehow that's not working, and that's worrying. And that's because it asks a question about how can democracies deliver on the situation we're currently facing. And if there's one thing I wouldn't want to lose, it's our democracies. Maybe I leave it there. Straight on.
When the Financial Times was reporting on the protest in France, they quoted one of the yellow vests saying, "The elites are worried about the end of the world, and I am worried about the end of the month." Right? Somebody needs to worry about the long term, about the end of the world, about future growth, about global warming. And the elites do worry about this, but elites are terrible at communicating their concerns and communicating what needs to be done. And part of the reason why they are terrible is because the emotional aspect of the debate is being ignored. So if you think about globalization, we have been ignoring the cultural aspect. So there are British communities which see inflow of my compatriots, migrant workers like myself, who speak a foreign language and change the composition of the local community. At the same time, in Poland, Poland sees inflow of Ukrainians, inflows of foreigners. Poland is under pressure to offer more protection to minorities of various preferences or ethnicity. And it's difficult for both countries, and it's something we have been ignoring. Finally, I wonder whether we have done a lot of, whether we've put a lot of thought into the educational system, and particularly the two-tier aspect of the educational system. So a system where state-funded schools coexist with fee-paying schools. And I wonder whether in some countries this is not leading the idea that you have two types of schools that leads to undermining of the state-sponsored system and is exacerbating inequality.
Great, thank you. I'm going to open it up for questions. I think I'll take them in groups of 3, if that's all right. One here, lady here. Take one more if there's I had covers this Tony and the gentleman in the back. I think there's a. I'll just pass this mic to you in case.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Tara Alice from McKinsey. Thank you, first of all, for a very interesting and fascinating panel discussion. I too will start with a quick anecdote, but then I do have a question for all of you on the panel. So my anecdote is regarding the UK's retraining scheme, which was part of the industrial strategy that we've discussed. And McKinsey estimates, and there are many other estimates, with an insane ballpark that by 2030, maybe something like 10 million people in the UK will need to retrain to move occupation. So not just retrain a little bit, 2 hours here and there, but actually genuinely to move to a new occupation. And the retraining scheme that we have currently, admittedly a pilot, is £10 million. So that's £10 per person. I suspect it isn't going to be enough for all those people. And so I think I'm just reinforcing the point that often when people talk about productivity, trade, technology, whatever, it's easy to focus on education, but that's a trickle effect relative to the existing workforce we already have. 80% of whom will still be there in 2030, and we need to kind of somehow figure out how to help them. My question is, in the context of it, feels to me like the way the elite or economists or other people have been looking at the data, we were kind of led astray. Certainly I will admit to, looking at average GDP per person, or, even Gini indices or whatever, kind of concluding, well, there isn't much of a big problem here. And yet we've been surprised by the degree to which there really is a big problem in terms of how people feel. And my question really is, what should we be measuring in order to truly understand what's going on in people's lives, what's happening at the kind of more emotional level, not just because we care, because we should care, but also because that to me is much more important in terms of predicting the political economy, and somehow we need to get smarter at that. So I would love to hear your suggestions.
Can I ask you to pass the microphone here? And also if you could introduce yourself briefly.
Thank you. Sheila Page, obviously Development Institute. I think I want to ask the opposite question. Aren't you in danger of ignoring the fact that we are, as Stephen in particular pointed out, in the middle of a very long, I hope not in the middle, at the end of a very long period of, at best, constant, and in many cases, falling real income. This is why people are worried about redistribution. It's why people are worried. If when all things are growing a lot, people are less worried. We've seen this in the past. And when you have this long a period, what was a temporary bout of protection in the 70s, which we all thought was a great pity, but it was temporary, but so was the fall in income in the 70s. We've now had a period when it's not that people don't understand that things aren't zero-sum, it's that in fact they have been pretty zero-sum for the last 40 years. There's nothing particularly odd about people believing that what is happening is happening. It is happening. So I wondered really whether there is a serious risk that you're throwing out a lot of commitment to globalization, commitment to this system on the basis of what one hopes is a temporary phenomenon of people adjusting to a feeling of discouragement because of lack of growth of income. I mean, there were two elements of optimism, a bit, in that we have some idea that some countries can manage education. And I was very struck by the discussion of the taxation reforms, which I hadn't been following properly. This strikes me as an important innovation in international governance as GATT was in 1947. It's just as much of a change if it really happens. So the glass isn't all empty. And I just would like one other thing. I would like some mention of developing countries, and I don't count Poland as one, or any one of the other Eastern European. Their income has continued to grow. Globalization has not become quite such a dirty word. And I think there's been a certain amount of closed community of the developed countries in this room.
Okay. Could you pass it to Tony behind you? Yes.
Tony Venables, Oxford. I'm surprised we didn't hear a little bit more about place and sort of spatial aspects of this. You know, we're sitting here in London, which is, you know, on the whole doing fine. We're living in, you know, to use Ed Glazer's phrase, the age of the triumph of the city. But of course there's a divergence. There are the booming cities and an awful lot of those that are really stranded. And, you know, with that, we know the spatial pattern of voting in referendums. We know it's a source of envy, resentment. We know that a lot of identity is associated with place. If your place is suffering, your identity is suffering. I think, you know, being driven by some pretty basic economic forces. If a place loses its traditional comparative advantage, a lot of nasty feedback mechanisms cut in. You know, some obvious economic linkage things that we talk about, probably more important social things. Decline of public services, selective out-migration, inability to attract good teachers, low motivation of students to perform because the jobs aren't there. So an awful lot of nasty feedback mechanisms. And of course that makes policy very, very difficult. You don't have the automatic adjustment mechanisms, you're on a low-level track that's in equilibrium. So I suppose I have to ask the question, you know, what are your policy suggestions? Although I will make one further comment. There is, of course, one very good immobile tax base in the booming cities. You know what it is, I mean, it's land.
Land, love taxes. Yes, please, pass it to the gentleman behind you. Yeah.
All right, so Alan Carter from HMRC. I'm not going to comment on the G20 stuff because that's inappropriate. It's ongoing. But I wanted to ask you about your narrowing down about how comment on Switzerland that people understand tax. You know, in particular, all the economic evidence, or most economic evidence, says that corporate taxes are brought by workers in the form of lower wages. So I just wonder, was the tax policy as a potential solution another area where actually things break down because people don't actually understand tax policy, people don't understand the economic incidence of taxes. So, or if you do think Swiss people understand more about taxes, how is that brought about?
Okay, let's, I'll just ask members of the panel what they'd like to respond to. Something on retraining, something on states, something on developing countries. I don't know, I feel you want to say something.
I mean, the issues that have been raised here, they each deserve a separate discussion. It's just impossible to handle them as part of an answer. But I would like perhaps to make sort of two related comments, or two comments in response to some of the questions. I don't think that we have seen falling incomes. It's just not the case. I mean, there have been people who suffered falling incomes, but this has always been the case. It's not something new. If we look through history, whenever there were changes, some people came out ahead and others were left behind. This is not something new. So the big question is, what is sort of new now? And I don't think that the big changes that we have seen in terms of the distribution of income is the result of globalization. It's just the evidence is not there. There are many other factors that have influenced this. Now, what we have seen, which impinges on how the economies are perceived these days, is a slowdown in productivity growth. This is quite broad. This we have seen. And the question is, where does it come from? So one can take a pessimistic view like Robert Gordon and say, you know, all the clever inventions have been done, and now, you know, we don't have any new ideas anymore, and therefore we are doomed in the future to grow very slowly. There are many reasons why this is not a reasonable position, right? But I want to raise one point that has to do with it. And this is the following. Growth patterns over time, they are never smooth. So there is, for example, a view of growth in which we invent what we call a general purpose technology. And when this happens, other inventors build on this general purpose technology. And then during the initial phase of response to the introduction of the general purpose technology, there's some slowdown in productivity growth. And then eventually it picks up. And there are cases in which this has been well documented. The issue is, of course, that this type of patterns, they are very long lasting. So we are talking about 30, 40 years until this type of pattern works out. So it's possible that we are now at the end of inventions on one or a couple of very important general purpose technologies, and we see the slowdown. Now there are some signs, like, for example, in the US, the rate of entry and exit of firms has slowed down, so this is a sort of sign of less dynamism. And there are other signs that we can discuss. There's the issue of mechanization, robotics, replacement of workers. So here also, one doesn't have to be necessarily pessimistic. So one view, which says that this type of inventions of new tasks for workers are primarily initially for higher skilled workers. And then the question is whether the lower skilled workers will move to this task over time. So we have this pull on the one hand, then the robots come in at the bottom and they push out workers on the other. And then at the end, this is a race between these two types of developments. And the question is, what is the net outcome? So there's a view like this, and we don't know the answer yet, if this can be worked out. But my point is that there are many other things that are happening in the economy, and we cannot blame everything on globalization. It's just not right. And if we are talking about evidence-based policies, we obviously cannot do it. Okay, so this is one point. The other point is in response to Tony's question about the spatial elements. So the spatial element, obviously we know that's important because there are all these studies that show that there are spatial distributions that are generated by globalization and also by other forces. But they are actually very different in different countries. So everybody knows the US studies, where there is good evidence that the spatial distribution was uneven. But for example, if you look at Germany, there has been something similar, but much milder. And in Germany, it wasn't due to the China shock, but rather more due to the East European shock. Yes. And then you can look at Brazil, for which we also have good studies, and then it was an equalizing force, a spatial equalizing force. But there are, of course, disequalizing spatial forces, and well, you are the expert on cities. Cities are important. We want big cities. They provide a lot of useful things. And the question is what to do with the periphery under these circumstances. So we have to find ways to compensate them. And I've mentioned already twice, and this is the third time, that we need networks to support people who are hurt by whatever the developments are. It can be globalization, it can be technology, it can be other forces. I mean, a lot of damage is caused by government policies as well.
Mary.
I'll start with Alan Hedman's point on things are not changing. We have seen this before, and that will bring me to taxation. In this chapter by Carlos Boix, in the book I mentioned before, he describes different episodes over time of increased openness and how that has led to demand for more government intervention, more protection. So there was a period in the UK, early 20th century, where that was a period also of a lot of openness, and there was social uprising and requests for more taxation on taxes on landowners or enterprises, I don't know. And there's a quote in that chapter by the Duke of Northumberland, and he said in 1909, he wrote to a friend, apparently I have to choose between protectionism and socialism, which is an increase in taxes. If I have to choose between the two, I choose protectionism. And maybe we had a repeat of this now. On taxation, I do not want to claim that the Swiss understand taxation better, but I think if the Swiss voter, I think the kind of policy we are looking for in order to have a socially sustainable open economy, it's a policy mix that's quite sophisticated. And the advantage of a system like the Swiss, which you probably can't replicate in every country, it also depends on the size of the country, but they can, in individual votes, compose their mix of policies. And that's difficult, and if not impossible, in the kind of, in a standard political system where you vote every few years for a party program. I am convinced that the median voter is not happy that he or she pays taxes and that big multinationals don't. That's something people understand. And I have been advising trade policy makers to communicate on what their finance ministry is doing, which is usually not the case. The trade negotiator negotiates a trade deal and doesn't talk about what the finance ministry is doing on the taxation side. But if you are saying, yes, we open up the borders to trade, but we ensure that the multinationals that come also pay taxes, I think that people would appreciate that. But it hasn't been tried out yet, so I don't know.
Shall I take Winter? Go ahead.
Just to touch on taxation, I think what matters to people more rather than the tax rate is the fact that the company is paying taxes, that it's contributing to the local community. So it's this sense of fairness. And there are some companies that are seeing this, that are looking ahead and who are taking seriously what's called the triple bottom line. So for instance, what they say is we need to make a project will go ahead if it fulfills 2 out of 3 criteria, right? It brings profit to the firm, it does something for the people or the planet. And I'm hoping that we will see more on that front, more development.
I think I have time to take another quick round of questions if people are brief. Yeah?
Thank you very much. If the issue is inequality and what we do about it, we actually know what to do. I mean, before I came to this, I looked through Tony Atkinson's book and his 15 proposals for a way forward. And I mean, there are 2 key aspects of it. One is reducing pre-tax inequalities, which means action in the labour market and also means a more equal distribution of capital. And then there is the redistributive phase, and you've got to do both. And I think this point is very widely accepted by everybody who's looked at this. I think the question is, not so much what has globalization done in terms of causing inequality, but how does it affect the feasibility and efficacy of this list of solutions? I mean, you know, if some of these labour market interventions involve what I call distortions in the labour market, minimum wages, maximum ratios of top to, how does globalization affect the benefits of that, and how does it affect the costs, if you like, the efficiency costs of distortions? And similarly, education. And we know that in a more open economy, expanding education is not going to narrow wage differentials as much as it would in a more closed economy. So we know something about that. But then the most worrying thing is coming back to your point originally, Minouche, which is that none of this will happen without a political consensus. So then you have to ask, has globalization actually made it more difficult to achieve the kind of political consensus that we need and that we used to have, and apparently some people still have in the Nordic countries to make this happen? So I think that's, in a way, the question I would ask about globalization and inequality, not how it affected the causes, but how it affects the menu of solutions and their efficacy.
Thank you, Adrian. Now, just maybe if you could pass it right behind you to the gentleman in the back. Any other? And then we'll come back to this.
It's a very quick one, but one of the sort of themes coming out of what you're saying is that my father's generation made much better decisions than my generation and much better decisions than my children's generation. Yet if you actually look at the relative education levels, it's a completely inverse story. So My suggestion is this has nothing to do with population you're talking to. It has everything to do with people you're talking to.
Okay. Let's take the gentleman in the back here.
Joe Rice, Office for National Statistics. I'm wondering actually whether we're really asking the right question. I mean, I know more about the UK than about other countries in this respect. But two factoids. One is, on almost any measure, inequality has declined over the last 10 or 15 years, not the reverse. And secondly, we've had, notwithstanding I think what Eli was suggesting, a period now of more than 10 years, quite unprecedented in UK history, where incomes have not grown at all appreciably. So I'm wondering if the question isn't really how do we get people to love globalisation, or how do we get inclusive growth, but why hasn't globalisation led to those benefits in terms of higher living standards that we might have expected 20 years it would have done, not least given that apparently we've had significant technical progress in the interim, again quite unprecedented kind.
Okay, why don't I start in reverse order? So I will start with you, Bit, and we'll work our way back. And you can make any sort of final remarks, reflections, as well as respond to some of those comments.
So why globalization hasn't...
Why is globalization disappointed, I guess, not to deliver the kind of benefits that one would have expected?
I mean, perhaps because all the low-hanging fruits have been picked, right? The globalization has been going on for quite a few decades now, and perhaps in the last 10 years, you know, all these sort of easy gains we could have made have been achieved. What has globalization made it more difficult to achieve political consensus? I mean, here, if you think about the current trade war between the US and China, it's no longer about trade, right? It's about strategic dominance. And the fact that globalization fueled the rise of China means that suddenly this has become an issue, and that has made it perhaps difficult to achieve political consensus on continuing globalization.
Thank you. Marion.
Yeah, so that were of course difficult and important questions at the very end. Has globalization not brought benefits? Well, it has brought benefits for some important countries like China. So many people lifted out of poverty, and for 1% of the population in the industrialized economies. That's a very squeezed distribution of those benefits, and that's something we have to think about. I couldn't agree more with Aidan's point. That's the way we wanted to turn the discussion 10 years ago. Let's stop discussing causes. Let's see whether it has affected our activity to act. And that's maybe also a bit behind this call for strong politicians that we currently see in votes, that the voters feel this. It's my government can't do anymore what we would like them to do. Last but not least, I would like to get back to one point, what should we measure? One thing should maybe have emphasized more is another point that I think is important, is insecurity. The insecurity people have felt in the past decades, partly through globalization. I think the financial shock has been a big hit to trust in the communities as we know it. In a country like Germany, people now think, I'm German by the way, that their pensions are not safe anymore. That was, during decades, not a question. Of course you're going to get a pension. My WTO pension is maybe not safe. Swiss pensions are not safe. It's something we have put money aside, trusted into a system, and we don't know what's going to happen to it. And now, after having gone through those shocks, including migration and terrorist attacks, we're going to get this artificial intelligence stuff. I understand that people are concerned. People are looking for a guidance and wanting to see what the future is going to bring them. And that's what they will be expecting from policymakers in the near future.
Okay, there's a recurring theme here about the issues of inequality and about falling incomes. So the problem with falling incomes now is that the income distribution is wide. It's true, as Joe says, that inequality hasn't risen very much in the last 10 years, but it hasn't. There's been the change is tiny backwards, and actually the only reason why earnings inequality has narrowed in the last 10 years is because the minimum wage, people on the minimum wage have done better, and that's because of actually it's one policy tool that can be used to keep wages up. And everybody else has fallen back. That's only because of the minimum wage. I mean, the 90-10 wage differential now, most recent, I went out the other day in the most recent info survey, so somebody is paid 4 times, somebody in the 90th percentile is paid 4 times as much as somebody in the 10th percentile. That was 2.6 in 1980. It's massively higher, and it's stayed high. It's also true that income inequality, family income inequality, hasn't gone up as much as individual earnings inequality. That's because the tax and benefit system has kept stuff reform. But inequality is way high now, and there's been no narrowing at all. I completely agree with Ellen that it's not driven by globalisation. It's been driven by technical change, a combination of technical change and decline of labour market institutions that traditionally kept wages up. So in Britain, the decline of trade unions and collective bargaining has been an important role, and that's interacted with technical changes that have driven up the skilled and unskilled wage premium. So the problem, just to go back to what I was saying about falling incomes mattering more now because income distribution is wider. So of course, what this does, it has been around for a long time. Incomes have fallen at the bottom end of the distribution for a long time, but it generates a bigger penalty now because there's a wider distribution, or indeed a bigger premium at the top. And so this is why, in my talk, I hope maybe I didn't explain as clearly as I might have done, this issue about falling absolute intergenerational ability, the proportion of children at the same age as their parents earning less than they did is a direct consequence of this. And this is really a very, very worrying thing. It's actually verified if you look at young people's responses to questions when they're asked about do they think they're going to do better than their parents did. There was a much, much bigger proportion of young people, millennials in particular, who really think that they're not going to do anywhere near as well as their parents did. In absolute terms, not in relative, but in absolute terms. And this is extremely worrying, and of course the sluggish productivity growth has pulled everybody's earnings down. And so actually, going back to the question that was asked here, this period of falling real wages in Britain over the last, since 2005, is actually the longest on record. You actually have to go back to Victorian times to get any where records were much, measurement is an issue, but actually you have to go back to Victorian times to find anything like what's happened here. And so the issue about falling or stagnant real wages coupled with poor productivity performance seems to be the kind of thing that I think that's important. And as Adrian says, political consensus about trying to tackle those two things together seems to be thinking maybe it's been not so much inequality, it's actually falling or stagnant real wages that really matters more here. But of course, as I say, you get this double whammy because if the distribution is wider, you get a bigger penalty for a percentage, a given percentage of falling wages or rising wages. Can I just say one more? So just because I missed the round last time. So the issue about spatial stuff. So I'd like to come back to the unintended consequences of education expansion again. So actually, one ironic feature actually was expanding education means that many more people, the kids who were doing best in school in certain places left and to go to university, and of course never went back. So there's a kind of selective out migration. Nobody ever goes back. You kind of pick up the coastal towns as kind of examples. I mean, I'm from Wolverhampton. I don't live in Wolverhampton. I live in London. And these kind of things like that. So I think how to try and seriously deal with that is actually one of the big challenges. You want to put it under industrial policy planner, or you want to put it under economic growth, or whatever value. But I think that's actually really, really important to try and think of those kind of things.
Any final thoughts?
Yes, so I mean, each one of us sort of emphasize the issue of job insecurity, employment insecurity, income insecurity. And it's clear that almost every economist that I know agrees that this has to be addressed. It has to be addressed both because of globalization, because of other reasons. And the globalization is not very different from other sources. For example, in the US, there were studies of people who lost their jobs. And if you look at the characteristics of people who lose jobs due to import competition or due to technical change or other reasons, they all look alike. There is really no difference in the nature of the people who lose jobs, depending on the source of the shock. So, as far as globalization is concerned, well, I don't know if it has really disappointed. Obviously, there are people who think that globalization is disappointed. I don't know what their expectations were to begin with. But if something disappoints or not, it sort of depends on expectations. But Steve mentioned already, or maybe Marion mentioned this, the fact is that globalization played a very important role in poverty reduction around the world. In a period of about 20 years, 600 million people who lived in a miserable life, yes, moved up and their life improved a lot. But I want to also point out another dimension of inequality, and this is inequality across countries. Because the personal distribution of income in the world economy is a combination of two things. One is the distribution of income across countries on the one hand, and the distribution of income within each country on the other. So if you look historically, what happened is that this personal distribution of income around the globe had been rising for many years. And the source of this income, of this inequality increase, was primarily the rise in income inequality across countries. This was driving these differences. Now, this was a period of rapid growth in many ways, and this rapid growth could not have been sustained actually without globalization. And I mean, there are studies which show how these international channels impacted the growth rates. Now, this came to a halt in the sense that this type of distribution has stabilized, and now we deal with rising inequality in countries, and particularly in the rich countries. And it is a serious issue. But as I said, we cannot really blame globalization on what's happening, and we better focus our attention on how to deal with people who are hurt by it. And so already a number of things were mentioned, and Tony will design for us place-based policies, and I think everything will be fine.
Okay. Well, I think that ends us on a slightly more optimistic note. I wanted to thank the panelists for, I think this is a very interesting moment in history, and I think all of us are trying to understand why we are where we are and how do we get to a better place. And I think you've really helped us break down the problem and provide us some examples of solutions. I don't think we're there yet, but I think we're getting there. And please join me in thanking the panel for helping us figure things out.